On November the 2nd, 2016, Sherri Papini vanished without a trace from her quiet neighborhood in Redding, California. A devoted mother, a loving wife, and a pillar of her community, gone in broad daylight. What followed was a nationwide search, a family in turmoil, and a story that would grip, then shock, the nation. Let us know which country or state you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories. It was a crisp autumn afternoon in Shasta County. The Papini family home sat nestled among the pines, a picture of suburban tranquility. Sherri Papini, 34 years old, was known for her bright smile and energetic spirit. She was a stay-at-home mom, raising her 2 young children while her husband Keith worked at a local Best Buy. Their lives, by all outward appearances, were ordinary, until that Wednesday. Sherri's morning began like any other. She texted Keith, made breakfast for the kids, and planned to go for a jog along the rural roads near their home. At 11:00 a.m., she left the house, her phone in hand, her running shoes laced. She never returned. By 5 p.m., Keith Papini arrived home from work. The house was eerily quiet. The children were still at daycare and Sherri was nowhere to be found. Her phone calls went unanswered. Panic set in. Keith's concern quickly turned to fear as he discovered Sherri's cell phone lying on the ground at the intersection of Sunrise Drive and Old Oregon Trail, her earbuds tangled and strands of her blonde hair caught in the wires. At 5:51 p.m., Keith dialed 911. His voice trembled as he told the dispatcher, "I just got home from work and my wife's not here. She went jogging and I found her phone." The operator's questions came quickly. "When did you last see her? Was there any sign of a struggle?" Keith's answers were desperate, but clear. Sherri was missing, and something was terribly wrong. Within hours, the Shasta County Sheriff's Office launched a search. Deputies canvassed the area, helicopters circled overhead, and volunteers combed the woods. The Papini family's nightmare had begun. News of Sherri's disappearance spread rapidly. Local media picked up the story, and soon, national outlets were broadcasting her photo, a petite woman with striking blue eyes and long golden hair. The public responded with an outpouring of sympathy. Social media lit up with hashtags, "Find Sherri," "Bring Sherri Home." Flyers appeared on telephone poles, in shop windows, and on car windshields. The community rallied, organizing search parties and candlelight vigils. Keith Papini became the face of the search. In interviews, he pleaded for his wife's safe return, his anguish visible. "Bring her home," he begged, his voice cracking. "We miss her. We love her." The couple's children, just 2 and 4 years old, were shielded from the media storm, but their mother's absence was a wound that would not heal. As days turned into weeks, the investigation intensified. The FBI joined the case, bringing in specialized agents and forensic experts. They scoured Sherri's phone records, interviewed friends and family, and reviewed surveillance footage from nearby businesses. Theories swirled. Was this a random abduction, a targeted attack, or something more sinister? The Papini family offered a $50,000 reward for information leading to Sherri's return. Donations poured in from across the country. The case drew comparisons to other high-profile disappearances: Lacey Peterson, Elizabeth Smart, stories that had ended in tragedy or, in rare cases, miraculous survival. But as the search dragged on, hope began to fade. The woods yielded no clues. The phone and earbuds found so neatly placed raised questions. Was this a sign of a struggle or a staged scene? Investigators kept their theories close, but the public's anxiety grew. Then, on Thanksgiving morning, 22 days after she vanished, the unthinkable happened. At 4:30 a.m., a passing motorist spotted a woman stumbling along Interstate 5, 150 miles south of Redding. She was emaciated, bruised, and shackled at the waist. Her long hair was cut short, her body marked with bruises and burns. It was Sherri Papini. The news broke like a tidal wave. Sherri was alive. She had survived. The nation rejoiced. In interviews, Keith wept with relief. "She's safe," he said, holding back tears. "That's all that matters." The Papini family was reunited, and the community celebrated what seemed like a miracle. But as the details of Sherri's ordeal emerged, the story took a darker turn. She told investigators she had been abducted at gunpoint by two Hispanic women, held captive in a dark room, and abused for weeks. She described her captors in chilling detail, their accents, their tattoos, the way they taunted her. She said she had been branded, starved, and beaten. Her injuries were real, her fear palpable. The FBI released composite sketches of the alleged abductors. Roadblocks were set up, and tips flooded in. The search for Sherri's kidnappers became a top priority. But as weeks passed, no suspects were found. No witnesses came forward. Surveillance footage from the area showed nothing unusual. The case, once so clear-cut, began to unravel. Behind the scenes, investigators noticed inconsistencies in Sherri's story. Her timeline shifted. Details changed. The physical evidence didn't match her account. The branding, the restraints, the location where she was found, none of it added up. The FBI pressed for answers, but Sherri remained steadfast. She was a victim, she insisted. She wanted justice. The public, too, was divided. Some believed Sherri without question, moved by her suffering and her family's pain. Others whispered doubts. Was it possible she was lying? Could someone endure such trauma and fabricate the details? The media, once sympathetic, began to ask harder questions. As the investigation dragged on, the Papini case faded from the headlines. The search for her alleged abductors continued, but leads dried up. Sherri retreated from public view, her family seeking privacy and healing. But for law enforcement, the case was far from over. In the years that followed, the FBI quietly pursued new leads. They re-examined evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, and followed the money trail. What they discovered would shock the nation and shatter the image of Sherri Papini as a victim. The return of Sherri Papini was, at first, a cause for celebration. But as the initial shock faded, investigators found themselves facing more questions than answers. The public, still reeling from the emotional roller coaster, watched closely as law enforcement worked to piece together the truth behind Sherri's disappearance and miraculous reappearance. In the days following her rescue, Sherri was treated at a local hospital. Her injuries were documented: bruises, abrasions, a branding mark on her shoulder, and significant weight loss. She was visibly traumatized, flinching at sudden movements and struggling to recount her ordeal. Medical staff noted her physical state, but also observed that some wounds appeared older than others, and the branding was oddly precise. The FBI and Shasta County Sheriff's Office conducted a series of interviews with Sherri. She described her captors as two Hispanic women, both armed, who spoke mostly Spanish. She claimed they wore masks and kept her chained in a small, dark room. According to Sherri, she was fed sporadically, beaten, and threatened with death if she tried to escape. She said she was branded with a heated tool as a form of punishment. Investigators pressed for details. What did the room look like? Did she hear any sounds, traffic, voices, music? Could she remember any landmarks from her drive to the location where she was released? Sherri's answers were vague. She said she was blindfolded most of the time, and that her captors spoke little English. She described the women's voices, their clothing, and even the scent of their perfume. But when asked to provide more specifics, her memory faltered. Despite the inconsistencies, law enforcement treated Sherri as a victim. The trauma she displayed was real, and her family's anguish was undeniable. The FBI released composite sketches based on her descriptions, and the search for the two women intensified. Roadblocks were set up along Interstate 5, and tips poured in from across California and beyond. But none led to a breakthrough. Meanwhile, the Papini family tried to return to normal life. Keith Papini, once the face of the search, now shielded his wife from the media. He spoke of her nightmares, her fear of being alone, and the toll the ordeal had taken on their children. The community, too, was divided. Some neighbors organized fundraisers and support groups, while others whispered doubts behind closed doors. As weeks turned into months, The investigation hit a wall. No physical evidence linked anyone to Sherri's alleged abduction. Surveillance footage from the area where she was found showed no sign of the SUV she described. DNA collected from her clothing and body was sent to the FBI's crime lab, but the results were inconclusive. The branding, which Sherri said was done by her captors, appeared to have been made with a tool commonly found in homes. The FBI began to look more closely at Sherri's past. They discovered a history of erratic behavior, including a previous incident in which she had run away from home as a teenager. Old acquaintances described her as dramatic and attention-seeking, but none of this was proof of deception, only context. Keith Papini remained steadfast in his support. In interviews, he described the pain of seeing his wife suffer. "She's been through hell," he said. "We just want to move on." The couple's children, now the focus of their attention, struggled to understand why their mother was afraid to leave the house. The media, once sympathetic, began to ask harder questions. National outlets ran stories about the lack of evidence and the mounting costs of the investigation. Some commentators compared the case to other high-profile hoaxes, while others cautioned against blaming the victim. The public's faith in Sherri's story began to waver. Behind the scenes, the FBI continued to dig. They re-examined Sherri's phone records and financial transactions. They interviewed friends, family, and co-workers. They looked for any sign of a motive, money, attention, a troubled marriage. But nothing concrete emerged. Then, in 2017, a break in the case. DNA found on Sherri's clothing did not match her husband, nor did it match any known criminal in the FBI's database. But it did match a man living in Southern California, a man with whom Sherri had once been romantically involved. Investigators tracked him down and questioned him. He admitted that Sherri had stayed with him during the time she was missing, but insisted he had no idea she was reported as abducted. He said she told him she needed to get away from her life for a while. This revelation changed everything. The man described how Sherri had arrived at his apartment with no visible injuries. She cut her hair, inflicted wounds on herself, and asked him not to contact anyone. He said he eventually drove her back to Northern California, where she was found on the side of the road. Confronted with this evidence, Sherri denied any wrongdoing. She insisted she had been kidnapped and abused. But the facts no longer supported her story. The FBI began to suspect that Sherri had staged her own abduction, enlisting the help of her former boyfriend to disappear for 3 weeks. The public reaction was swift and fierce. Supporters felt betrayed. Critics demanded answers. The Papini family, once the focus of national sympathy, now faced suspicion and scorn. The GoFundMe account set up to support the search came under scrutiny, as did the $50,000 reward money. Law enforcement officials faced their own reckoning. The resources devoted to the search, hundreds of hours, thousands of dollars, had been based on a lie. The FBI issued a statement saying, "We are committed to uncovering the truth wherever it leads. The integrity of our investigation is paramount." As the investigation continued, Sherri Papini retreated from public view. Her family closed ranks, refusing interviews and declining to comment on the new evidence. The community, once united in hope, was now divided by anger and disbelief. But the case was far from over. The FBI continued to build its case, gathering evidence, and preparing for what would become one of the most shocking revelations in recent true crime history. As the months passed, the Papini case transformed from a story of survival to a puzzle of deception. The FBI's discovery of the ex-boyfriend's involvement was a turning point. The narrative that had once inspired hope and unity now sowed seeds of doubt and suspicion. Investigators quietly intensified their efforts. They re-examined every detail of Sherri's account, comparing her statements to the evidence. The ex-boyfriend, whose DNA had been found on Sherri's clothing, became a key witness. He described in detail how Sherri had contacted him months before her disappearance, rekindling an old relationship under the guise of needing help to escape an abusive marriage. He said she asked him to pick her up in Redding on November 2, 2016, the very day she was reported missing. He recounted how Sherri had arrived at his apartment in Costa Mesa, hundreds of miles from her home, with no visible injuries. She stayed hidden, rarely leaving the apartment, and spent her days watching news coverage of her own disappearance. According to him, Sherri was calm, methodical, and determined to maintain the ruse. She cut her hair, inflicted superficial wounds on herself, and even asked him to help her create the brand on her shoulder. He refused, but she persisted, using a wood-burning tool to mark her own skin. The FBI corroborated his story with phone records, text messages, and surveillance footage. The evidence was overwhelming. Yet, when confronted, Sherri continued to insist she had been abducted. She maintained her story to law enforcement, her family, and the public, even as the facts crumbled around her. The legal pressure mounted. Federal agents began to build a case for fraud, focusing on the money raised through GoFundMe and the victim compensation funds Sherri had received. The Papini family's finances came under scrutiny. Investigators traced the flow of donations, examining whether Sherri had personally benefited from the public's generosity. Meanwhile, the community of Redding struggled to process the truth. Neighbors who had once organized search parties now felt betrayed. The sense of unity that had defined the early days of the search was replaced by anger and embarrassment. Local news outlets ran editorials questioning how so many could have been misled. National media too shifted their tone, running headlines that asked, "Was it all a lie?" Keith Papini, who had stood by his wife through the ordeal, faced his own reckoning. In private, he began to question the story he had so fiercely defended. In public, he remained silent, declining interviews and shielding his children from the growing storm. The couple's marriage, once a symbol of resilience, now appeared strained and uncertain. The FBI's investigation continued to uncover new details. They learned that Sherri had a history of fabricating stories, including false claims of abuse and self-harm dating back to her teenage years. Old friends and acquaintances described her as manipulative and attention-seeking, willing to go to great lengths to be the center of attention. Yet, none of this explained why she would orchestrate such an elaborate hoax as an adult, risking her family, her reputation, and her freedom. Psychologists weighed in, offering theories about Sherri's motivations. Some suggested she suffered from a personality disorder, driven by a need for attention and sympathy. Others pointed to the financial incentives, the donations, the victim compensation, the book and movie deals that often follow high-profile cases. But without a confession, the true motive remained elusive. As the investigation dragged on, the public's patience wore thin. Online forums filled with speculation and outrage. Some defended Sherri, arguing that trauma can cause memory lapses and inconsistencies. Others demanded accountability, insisting that the resources spent on the search could have been used to help real victims. In 2020, nearly 4 years after Sherri's disappearance, the FBI submitted their findings to the U.S. Attorney's Office. The evidence was clear. Sherri Papini had staged her own abduction, lied to law enforcement, and defrauded the public. But the pandemic delayed legal proceedings, and for a time, it seemed the case might fade into obscurity. Then, in March 2022, the story exploded back into the headlines. Sherri Papini was arrested and charged with making false statements to federal agents and mail fraud. The indictment laid out the case in stark detail. Sherri had planned her disappearance, enlisted her ex-boyfriend's help, and lied repeatedly to investigators. She had accepted more than $30,000 in victim compensation funds, money intended for real victims of crime. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. News crews descended on Redding, capturing images of Sherri being led away in handcuffs. The public, once united in hope, now watched in disbelief as the woman they had rallied behind faced federal charges. In court, Sherri appeared gaunt and subdued. She pleaded not guilty, her attorney arguing that she was a victim of trauma and mental illness. But the evidence was overwhelming. The ex-boyfriend testified, providing a detailed account of Sherri's actions during the 3 weeks she was missing. The FBI presented phone records, text messages, and financial documents that left little room for doubt. The legal consequences were severe. Sherri faced up to 25 years in prison if convicted on all charges. The GoFundMe money was frozen, and the Papini family's assets were scrutinized. The community, once so supportive, now demanded justice. The psychological toll on Sherri's family was immense. Keith Papini filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and the trauma inflicted on their children. In court documents, he described the pain of learning the truth, the betrayal he felt, and his desire to protect his children from further harm. The case became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the power of deception and the consequences of lies. The media, once eager to tell Sherri's story of survival, now dissected every detail of her deception. True crime podcasts and documentaries explored the case, analyzing the red flags and the failures of the investigation. But for the people of Redding, the wounds ran deep. The sense of community that had defined the early days of the search was gone, replaced by skepticism and mistrust. The Papini case had exposed the dark side of human nature, the capacity for manipulation, the hunger for attention, and the devastating impact of lies. As the legal process unfolded, the nation watched, waiting for answers. Why had Sherri Papini done it? What drove her to orchestrate such an elaborate hoax? And what lessons could be learned from a case that had captivated, then betrayed the public's trust? The arrest of Sherri Papini in March 2022 marked a dramatic turning point in a case that had already defied expectations. The woman once hailed as a survivor was now at the center of a federal prosecution. The charges, making false statements to federal agents and mail fraud, carried the weight of years behind bars. The public, once united in hope, now watched with a mixture of anger, disbelief, and morbid curiosity. In the days following her arrest, the details of the indictment were made public. The document was unflinching in its language. Sherri Papini planned and carried out her own disappearance, misled law enforcement, and defrauded the California Victim Compensation Board. The evidence was laid out in painstaking detail: text messages arranging her pickup, surveillance footage placing her in Southern California, and the ex-boyfriend's testimony describing her self-inflicted injuries. The media descended on Redding once again. News vans lined the quiet streets, reporters knocking on doors, seeking comment from neighbors and family members. The Papini home, once a symbol of hope, was now a focal point for outrage. The community that had once rallied around Sherri now felt betrayed, their trust shattered. In court, Sherri appeared subdued, her once bright demeanor replaced by a haunted expression. She pleaded not guilty, her defense team arguing that she was suffering from complex psychological issues. They pointed to her history of trauma, her struggles with anxiety and depression, and the immense pressure she felt as a wife and mother. But the prosecution was relentless, painting a picture of calculated deception and manipulation. The legal proceedings were closely watched. The prosecution called witnesses who described the impact of Sherri's actions, not just on her family, but on the entire community. Law enforcement officials testified about the resources devoted to the search, the hundreds of hours spent following false leads, and the emotional toll on officers who had believed they were racing against time to save a life. The ex-boyfriend's testimony was particularly damning. He described how Sherri had orchestrated every detail of her disappearance, from the timing of her departure to the injuries she inflicted on herself. He said she was calm and methodical, never expressing regret or second thoughts. His account was corroborated by phone records, text messages, and surveillance footage. The defense, meanwhile, sought to humanize Sherri. They called psychologists who described her as a deeply troubled woman, driven by a need for attention and validation. They argued that her actions, while wrong, were the result of untreated mental illness and a desperate desire to escape her life. But the jury and the public were not easily swayed. As the trial unfolded, the public's reaction was intense. Social media was flooded with commentary, much of it harsh and unforgiving. Some called for the maximum sentence, arguing that Sherri's actions had wasted valuable resources and undermined trust in real victims. Others expressed sympathy, suggesting that her mental health struggles deserved compassion, not condemnation. The Papini family, once the focus of national sympathy, now faced scrutiny and scorn. Keith Papini, who had filed for divorce, released a statement expressing his heartbreak and his desire to protect his children. "The trauma inflicted on our family is immeasurable," he wrote. "My priority now is to provide a safe and stable environment for our children." The community of Reading, too, was left to pick up the pieces. Local officials spoke of the need to rebuild trust, both within the community and with law enforcement. The case had exposed vulnerabilities in the system, how easily public sympathy could be manipulated, how quickly resources could be diverted from real emergencies. As the legal process moved forward, the psychological analysis of Sherri Papini became a subject of national debate. Experts weighed in on television and in print, offering competing theories about her motivations. Some described her as a classic case of Munchausen syndrome, a disorder characterized by the fabrication of illness or trauma for attention. Others pointed to narcissistic personality traits, suggesting that Sherri was driven by a need to be the center of attention, regardless of the cost. Court documents revealed more about Sherri's past. She had a history of making false claims, including allegations of abuse against her parents and previous partners. She had struggled with relationships, often seeking out drama and conflict. Friends described her as charming but manipulative, capable of winning sympathy even as she sowed discord. The prosecution argued that Sherri's actions were not the result of mental illness, but of deliberate, calculated choices. They pointed to the financial gain, the victim compensation funds, the GoFundMe donations, the potential for book and movie deals. They argued that Sherri had exploited the public's goodwill for personal benefit, with no regard for the consequences. The defense countered that Sherri was a deeply troubled woman, overwhelmed by the pressures of her life. They described her as a victim of her own mind, unable to control her impulses or seek help. They argued that prison would do nothing to address the underlying issues and called for treatment rather than punishment. The judge, faced with a case that defied easy answers, weighed the evidence carefully. In the end, the verdict was clear. Sherri Papini was guilty of making false statements and mail fraud. The sentence reflected the seriousness of her actions, but also acknowledged her mental health struggles. She was ordered to pay restitution, serve time in federal prison, and undergo psychological treatment. The public reaction was mixed. Some felt justice had been served, while others believed the sentence was too lenient. The case became a touchstone for debates about mental health, criminal justice, and the power of media narratives. For the Papini family, the ordeal was far from over. Keith Papini focused on rebuilding his life and caring for his children. The community of Reading worked to restore trust and move forward, and Sherri, once the face of a national search, now faced the consequences of her actions, alone and out of the spotlight. The Papini case left a lasting mark on all who followed it. It was a story of hope and heartbreak, of deception and discovery. It forced a reckoning with the ways in which we respond to tragedy, the power of media to shape our perceptions, and the importance of seeking truth, even when it is uncomfortable. As the dust settled, one question remained. What drives a person to such lengths? The answer perhaps lies not in the headlines or the court documents, but in the complex, often hidden struggles that shape our lives. The verdict in the Sherri Papini case reverberated far beyond the walls of the courtroom. For the Papini family, the community of Reading, and law enforcement agencies across the country, the fallout was both immediate and profound. The story that had once united neighbors in hope now left them grappling with anger, confusion, and a sense of betrayal. In the weeks following Sherri's sentencing, the Papini home remained shuttered and silent. Keith Papini, now a single father, focused on his children's well-being, determined to shield them from the relentless media attention. In a statement to the court, he wrote, "My children and I are victims too. We have to live with the consequences of Sherri's choices every day. The children, once the center of a family's joyful life, now faced a future marked by public scrutiny and private pain. The community of Reading, which had poured its heart into the search for Sherri, was left to pick up the pieces. Local leaders organized town hall meetings to address the lingering mistrust. Law enforcement officials spoke candidly about the emotional toll the case had taken on their teams. Sheriff Tom Bosenko, who had overseen the initial investigation, addressed the public directly. "We believed Sherri. We did everything we could to bring her home. The truth hurts, but it doesn't change our commitment to serve this community." For many, the case became a cautionary tale about the power of narrative and the dangers of misplaced trust. The GoFundMe campaign, which had raised tens of thousands of dollars, was frozen and eventually ordered to be repaid as part of Sherri's restitution. Donors expressed a mix of outrage and sadness, some feeling personally duped, others simply heartbroken that their goodwill had been exploited. The impact on law enforcement was equally significant. The Papini case prompted agencies across the country to re-examine their protocols for missing persons investigations. Training programs were updated to include lessons on detecting fabricated stories and managing high-profile cases in the age of social media. The FBI issued an internal memo emphasizing the importance of balancing empathy for victims with rigorous, evidence-based investigation. The case also sparked a broader conversation about the role of the media in shaping public perception. In the early days of Sherri's disappearance, her story had dominated headlines, fueled by emotional interviews and dramatic details. News outlets, eager for updates, often repeated unverified claims. When the truth emerged, many journalists reflected on their own role in amplifying the hoax. Some issued public apologies, others called for more responsible reporting in future cases. Psychologists and social workers weighed in, using the Papini case as a lens to examine the complexities of trauma, attention-seeking behavior, and the fine line between victimhood and deception. Dr. Laura Richards, a forensic psychologist, commented in a televised interview, "Cases like this are rare, but they remind us that not every story is as it seems. We must approach each case with compassion, but also with a critical eye." For real victims of abduction and abuse, the Papini case was a painful setback. Advocacy groups worried that the high-profile hoax would make it harder for genuine victims to be believed. "Every time a story like this comes to light, it chips away at public trust," said Sarah Walsh, director of a California-based victims advocacy organization. "We have to work twice as hard to ensure that real survivors are heard and supported." The legal community, too, took note. Prosecutors and defense attorneys debated the appropriate balance between punishment and treatment in cases involving mental health issues. The judge in Sherri's case, in his sentencing remarks, acknowledged the complexity. Ms. Papini's actions caused real harm, not just to her family and community, but to the integrity of our justice system. At the same time, we recognize the role that mental health played in her decisions. This sentence reflects both accountability and the need for treatment. As Sherri began her prison term, she was ordered to undergo psychological counseling and to pay more than $300,000 in restitution to the state, the federal government, and the donors who had supported her. The financial burden was significant, but the damage to her reputation was even greater. Once a symbol of hope, Sherri Papini was now a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly public perception can shift and how devastating the consequences of deception can be. The Papini case also left a mark on the true crime community. Podcasters, documentary filmmakers, and authors dissected every detail, searching for answers to the questions that still lingered. Why did Sherri do it? Was it for attention, money, or something deeper? Could anyone have seen the signs earlier? And what could be done to prevent similar cases in the future? For the people of Reading, the healing process was slow. Some neighbors reached out to the Papini children, offering support and friendship. Others kept their distance, wary of being drawn into further drama. The local church, which had hosted prayer vigils during Sherri's disappearance, now focused on helping the community move forward. Law enforcement agencies across the country took note of the lessons learned. The FBI's final report on the case included a stark warning. While the vast majority of missing persons cases are genuine, investigators must remain vigilant for signs of fabrication. The integrity of our system depends on our ability to discern truth from deception. In the end, the Papini case became more than just a story of one woman's lies. It was a mirror held up to society, reflecting our deepest hopes and fears, our capacity for empathy, and our vulnerability to manipulation. It forced a reckoning with the ways in which we respond to tragedy, the power of media to shape our perceptions, and the importance of seeking truth, even when it is uncomfortable. As the months passed, the headlines faded but the lessons remained. The Papini case was a reminder that justice is not always swift, that truth can be elusive, and that the consequences of deception can ripple far beyond the individual, touching families, communities, and the very fabric of society. The story of Sherri Papini's disappearance and the subsequent unraveling of her claims is more than a tale of one woman's deception. It is a case study in the complexities of truth, the power of narrative, and the far-reaching consequences of a single lie. As the dust settled, the nation was left to grapple with the lessons of a saga that had, for a time, captivated and then confounded millions. In the aftermath, law enforcement agencies, journalists, and advocacy groups all took stock. The FBI's final statement on the case was clear and direct. The Papini investigation required significant resources and collaboration across multiple agencies. While our mission is always to bring missing persons home, we must also ensure that our efforts are grounded in evidence and integrity. False reports undermine public trust and divert attention from those truly in need. For the Papini family, the journey toward healing was just beginning. Keith Papini, in his divorce filings, wrote, "The trauma inflicted on our family is immeasurable. My focus now is on our children and helping them understand that truth matters, even when it's painful." The community of Reading, once united in hope, was left with a sense of collective disillusionment. Local leaders emphasized the importance of rebuilding trust. At a town hall meeting, a city council member remarked, "We must not let one person's actions define us. Our compassion is our strength, but we must also be vigilant." The case also prompted a reckoning within the media. Journalists who had once amplified Sherri's story without question now reflected on the dangers of sensationalism. In a televised interview, a local news anchor admitted, "We wanted so badly for this to be a story of hope. In our rush to report, we lost sight of the need for skepticism and verification." For true crime enthusiasts and the broader public, the Papini case became a touchstone for discussions about victimhood, manipulation, and justice. Podcasts and documentaries dissected the red flags, Sherri's vague descriptions, the lack of physical evidence, the inconsistencies in her timeline. Experts weighed in on the psychological factors at play, from personality disorders to the pressures of modern life. Dr. Michael Stone, a forensic psychiatrist, explained in a national interview, "Cases like this are rare, but they remind us that the line between victim and perpetrator can sometimes blur. It's essential to approach each case with empathy, but also with a commitment to the facts." The legal consequences for Sherri Papini were significant. She was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, ordered to pay more than $300,000 in restitution, and required to undergo psychological counseling. In her statement to the court, Sherri finally admitted responsibility, saying, "I am deeply sorry for the pain I have caused my family, my community, and law enforcement. I will spend the rest of my life trying to make amends." But for many, the apology rang hollow. The damage had been done, not just to her family, but to the countless people who had searched, donated, and hoped. The case became a rallying cry for advocates of real victims who worried that future cases would be met with skepticism and doubt. Sarah Walsh, the victim's advocate, summed up the challenge ahead. "We cannot let one person's deception silence those who truly need help. Our job is to listen, to believe, but also to verify. The stakes are too high to do otherwise." Law enforcement agencies across the country updated their protocols, incorporating lessons from the Papini case. Training now emphasized the importance of corroborating victim statements, maintaining objectivity, and managing media relations in high-profile cases. The FBI's internal review concluded, while compassion is essential, it must be balanced with critical thinking and a commitment to the truth. For the people of Redding, the healing process was slow but steady. Community leaders organized support groups for those affected by the case, and local churches offered counseling for families and children. The Papini children, shielded from the worst of the media storm, began to rebuild their lives with the help of their father and extended family. The true crime community, always eager for answers, continued to debate the case. Was Sherri Papini a master manipulator, or a deeply troubled woman in need of help? Was the public too quick to believe, or too eager to judge? The questions lingered, a reminder of the complexities at the heart of every human story. In the end, the Papini case stands as a stark warning about the power of lies and the fragility of trust. It is a reminder that justice is not just about punishment, but about understanding, accountability, and the pursuit of truth. As one FBI agent put it, our job is to follow the evidence wherever it leads. The truth may be uncomfortable, but it is always necessary. The legacy of Sherri Papini's disappearance is not just a story of deception, but a call to vigilance, for law enforcement, for the media, and for all of us. It is a lesson in the importance of compassion, tempered by skepticism, of hope, balanced by reason, and of justice, guided always by the facts. As the nation moves on, the echoes of the Papini case remain. A cautionary tale for a world hungry for stories, and a reminder that, in the end, the truth matters most. Thank you for joining us as we unraveled the extraordinary and unsettling story of Sherri Papini, a case that challenged our assumptions about truth, victimhood, and the power of narrative. If this story resonated with you, or if you learned something new, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching from? And how did this case impact your view of true crime stories? Remember, behind every headline is a real community, real families, and real consequences. The Papini case reminds us to approach every story with empathy, but also with a critical eye. Because the search for truth is never simple, and justice demands both compassion and accountability. If you found this series compelling, don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth true crime investigations. Your support helps us bring you the stories that matter. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and always question the narrative.